joining us. Before I introduce our guests today, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm living and working on the land of the Gadigal people today, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. In fact, I'm in a place called Curl Curl on Sydney's northern beaches, in which, in the Darug language, means river of life. It's an important place of gathering for the Gadigal people, and so it's fitting for our webinar today. I'd like to thank the Gadigal people for protecting this coastline and its ecosystems. And while I welcome listeners here today, I'd especially like to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who have joined with us. So welcome to episode 2 of the Higher Business series titled Rethinking Stakeholder Engagement, Building Trust and Improving Outcomes. In this episode, we'll explore the critical role of stakeholder engagement in business success and how transparency and authenticity are essential to achieving meaningful outcomes. As new Australian environmental and sustainability laws and regulations evolve, businesses face both challenges and opportunities in building genuine relationships with their stakeholders in order to meet their compliance obligations and accelerate the achievement of their sustainability goals. I'd like to take a moment just to define or recognise who a stakeholder actually is. To me, it's anyone who has the ability to affect or is affected by a decision being made. So for a company, it's really anyone they already interact with, often grouped into categories like customer, supplier, investor, government and regulators, NGOs, community, etc. At the core of effective stakeholder engagement is trust. If an organisation engages with its stakeholders authentically, transparently, and with ethics, trust is built. If not, trust is diminished. And the cost of the loss of trust can be expensive, if not fatal, to an organisation. Those organisations with higher levels of trust have a lower cost of doing business, have less volatility in their share price, and can have higher market valuations. So let's dive in. We're joined today by Chris Andrews, who's described by some as a social enterprise mechanic and business troubadour. He works with First Nation enterprises and is committed to nation building, amongst other things. Cecilia Anthony is a former political advisor and works in advocacy, policy, and strategy. She's worked extensively with communities facing structural inequality and other challenges, and she recently joined the Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at UTS. Welcome to you both.
Thank
Chris
you.
and Cecilia will share their unique perspectives on fostering trust and innovation through authentic stakeholder interactions, from building partnerships across the value chain, navigating complex stakeholder community relationships. They'll discuss the practices that can help organisations engage effectively and ethically. Before we dive in, a quick word from our sponsor. So the Higher Business series is proudly brought to you by Wizer. Wizer is transforming stakeholder engagement by ensuring the right mix of voices are involved in every decision. With a live recommendation engine and insights into expertise and diversity, Wizer helps organisations build stronger, more inclusive panels while uncovering untapped talent. See how Wizer can elevate your stakeholder engagement strategy. Visit wizer.business for more. So thank you for joining us. We're so excited to hear about your experience and expertise in the future of stakeholder engagement. So where I'd like to begin, Chris, with you. What are the trends that you're seeing in stakeholder engagement currently?
I guess at the moment, the key trend that I see, it's increasingly becoming more and more transactional. Stakeholder engagement, consultations, something that's been undertaken almost at the end of the process, which in essence starts devaluing the opportunity that real engagement, real consultation, real and authentic sort of conversations with people can have at the start of the process. So, you know, there seems to be a trend away from doing what's authentic. There seems to be a trend away from doing what's inclusive. And so there's this sort of trend that is slowly and surely exhausting communities and pushing them away from real and fair input. So it's sort of this sad cycle downwards in terms of, because it's left at the end or devalued, the people participating are becoming less and less engaged, and then the input is becoming less and less valuable.
It's a sad state of affairs. What do you think is driving that, Chris?
I think this constant, need to engage in a particular framework, and it comes from a question and answer rather than a sort of an engaging and listening sort of approach. It's sort of, I've got to tick off a number of boxes. This is part of my 17 tasks I've got to do. One of them is, and I'll farm this out, get that done, add it in. But it's not part of a design. It's not part of a setting up and constructing a process. It's very much part of one of many steps that are being undertaken sort of from a compliance perspective. And I think that's where the value gets lost. And it might not come across that way, but it's very much perceived that way. And it's very transparent when somebody's there just doing lip service as opposed to truly there sitting and listening.
And we'll get into it in a minute around how to get it right. But Cecilia, I'm curious to hear from you. What do you think is the hardest part of getting it right?
I actually think, going on from what Chris has just said, that it's lifting the engagement piece out of a ticker box mentality for projects. And so part of that is about getting the timing right in two parts. It's the timing of the project and where you situate the community engagement. And unfortunately, I think most of the time that comes at the wrong end phase of a project instead of much earlier on. And then it's also about allowing enough time to create the community engagement piece respectfully and in a time frame that actually speaks more to the community that you're talking to rather than the time pressures of the project itself.
So what then, Chris, would be the elements you would see as important to getting it right?
I think it's where you're coming from. So somebody like myself is, am I part of the design process? Am I part of the governance process? And if you answer those questions in the affirmative, or you've got line of sight to this is contributing to the design of the process or the project, or it's contributing to the governance and how this project will be managed and its social license, then I think you're in a good place in terms of the practice you want to undertake from engagement. If you can't see that, then no matter how good you perceive your engagement skills, then it becomes abundantly clear to an audience that they're not there as part of this process, and a lot of what Cecilia said. So in terms of your contribution and how do you get your practice right, it's where you want to sit in that process. And if you can't see a line of sight to what you see for yourself as being important for the people that you're trying to engage with, then it's very difficult for you to front up and do an authentic consultation that's not bloody obvious to everybody. You're only there to tick a box.
You're both very experienced in this area, and I'm sure you've come across people within organisations that you've worked with who perhaps don't understand the true value of stakeholder engagement. What steps have you taken to help bring forward the engagement process and help those people undertake stakeholder engagement in a more authentic or meaningful way?
That's not how it works, Victoria. Clients, and I mostly work and have worked with government and the NGO sector, but I have done, particularly working with migrant communities, I have done a bit with private sector clients. We can't control the point at which they come to us to kickstart that community engagement, and it's usually way too late. The project's usually well and truly got legs, and ideas or decisions are starting to formulate by those who are in decision-making positions before they even do the engagement and consult with communities who those decisions are potentially going to affect. That's sort of the reality. I don't know, Chris, you might have had a different experience.
Arguably similar. I mean, in instances where where there's been a bit of pushback and a reevaluation of where it's gone, it's mainly prosecuted through the case of risk management. So there's going to be a financial risk in so much as, and coming at a lens of whether it's social license to operate or, protests or delays or the like, it really comes through, well, let's talk this through to your CFO, because this becomes a money story, and that normally resonates, as opposed to, I don't need to talk to the comms department and I don't need to talk to the PR department. I want to talk to the money department, because if we don't get this right, that's where things won't proceed, and that's where the costs are going. And I think there's probably testament to that in terms of some of the engagements that have obviously occurred in some of the major infrastructure, where we've seen the consequence of not good, smart consultation costing, entities, governments and major infrastructure organisations money down the track, because if they authentically looked at proper engagement, they would have got feedback about certain things that might not have cost them as much down the track to maybe rehabilitate what wasn't happening. And there's greater and greater risk as projects sort of run out of communities sort of saying, no, we don't want this, or we're going to delay it, or we won't participate, or it becomes increasingly a political issue. So it's for those who've got the foresight to see what the financial consequences are. They are the ones who normally are able to change. Vast majority, you don't get access to that conversation because it's ring fenced down somewhere else down the chain.
And I think I'm just reflecting as you talk on the transition to a low carbon economy and what's required for that in terms of moving to renewable energy and just the sheer number of landholders that need to be engaged with in order to have new poles and wires put through their properties and those sorts of things. And while all the technology can be solved and many other aspects of the problem can actually be solved now and today, probably one of the hardest parts is engaging and getting on board those landholders, which I think, we're talking about tens of thousands of landholders across Australia, including Indigenous communities. When you see this sort of engagement done well, what happens with those communities? Cecilia.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're brought in at the start of the process, and engagement is something that, when you're talking about engagement on that scale, it's, I think, a very different thing to what most of us are used to. But you need to bring in groups from the start, I think, and not as an afterthought or as that ticker box. And you need to be willing to, and talk about the client or the government who's making the decisions, needs to be willing to actually listen to what people are saying and be willing to change direction or shift from the original thought around what this is going to look like. And that's, I think we're a long way from that happening in a general sense in community engagement in Australia.
I mean, when it's done well, I think a lot of people from the fintech side of business would relate that it's done with a little bit more agility. And one of the opportunities is people often go in with a fixed set of questions, let's just say, and that opportunity when stories are shared to follow those threads, to follow that part of the engagement. So it's done well when two things happen. The temporal barrier that we've got to do this by a certain date gets lifted, and it's not, let's allow the process to run a little bit longer. Let's allow the process to pursue opportunities. And when the guardrails are certainly taken out of the process to allow a little bit more freedom in the commentary. And what are that ultimately, that greater investment in this process yields so much more multiplicity and benefits at the end, because it's not only de-risking the project, but it's enhancing its design and function. And in the First Nations space, the people who know best about what's going to happen on country, those who've been looking after it for thousands of years. There'll be stories, there'll be experience, this intergenerational sharing of knowledge that will only come out and be shared if communities have this sort of acceptance that there's a reciprocity of value. They see people coming in and investing in doing things, but it's got to be reciprocal, or it's just another bunch of people ripping the heart out of country and there's no benefit left. And what's the point? That's been the process for the last couple 100 years. And the sporadic opportunities where it's done better, it's typically been where the respect's on the table, the story's being told to its fullest, and people can see the result of that in the outcome of the project. But all too rare, as Cecilia sort of suggested, that you actually see this.
And we explained it as checking your power at the door. Before you enter the room or the space or wherever it is that you're going to be talking with people, that everyone checks their power at the door and comes in as an equal participant on the same level as everyone else. And if people can do that, that creates a really sound platform from which to start.
We've seen it go really wrong as well. It's often played out in the media. You'll see things, a couple of examples I was thinking about today were things like Yukon Gorge, the work up in the Tiwi Islands of late, even the northern beaches of Sydney in the newspaper in the last few days and their stakeholder engagement regarding rates that I'm feeling, essentially. I'm curious when you see things go as badly wrong as those sorts of examples, what's ringing in your mind of where the failure really occurred?
From my perspective, it's valuing. So you've mentioned a couple of sort of First Nations. It's this presumption, and it's a colonial bias. It's racism, and you step into the door. I'm just literally going to tell these folks what's going to happen. And Cecilia's point about checking power in. There's this presumption of power imbalance, and it does exist from an economic and a whole lot of positions, and it comes through the door, and it's sort of, well, this is going to happen. This is what we're going to do, and there's no listening. The ears are sort of ornamental, and the questions are whatever, just to make a noise. If it's happened at all, and people might say, oh, we did consult. And we didn't get any feedback. It's never been consultation. It's never been an engagement. It's been a soundbite and walked out. So fundamentally, within that sort of scenario, where it's gone horribly wrong in Australian context, and it's certainly from a colonial perspective, the basis is it started from a fairly racist perspective, and hasn't got any better from that.
Yeah, and I deal with primarily in engagement to community cohorts that are either over-consulted in the First Nations space, over-consulted, don't see change, don't see outcomes, or in the migrant, culturally and linguistically diverse space, just aren't consulted at all because people can't have a blinder on about what Australia actually looks like and what our population looks like. And there's, sort of a lot of nuances that sit underneath that. But when it's done well, it's done really well. I did a job years ago now for a residential building company in Western Sydney, and they wanted to find out from people from the subcontinent, so people primarily of the Hindu faith, what requirements they needed in a housing design, because there's a lot of sort of loose rules around, the direction a house faces and all of these sorts of things for a Hindu household. And so traditionally in Australia, people of that faith would try and retrofit their house to their faith. And this building company was trying to flip that and say, well, okay, how can we give you your requirements from the drawing board? And that was one of those rare occasions where you see, this is a private company doing absolutely thinking about this and doing the right thing. But that was a rare one. That was a rare one. Yeah.
It's interesting when you each share the power imbalance. I always think about the role of dignity and respect as a fundamental human right, and therefore sitting at the core of sustainability and sustainable practices, and of course at the core of stakeholder engagement as being so significant to this area and really making sure that people are able to get it right. Cecilia, you mentioned then over-consulting. Can you just explain a little bit what you mean by over-consulting and how that's experienced by the recipients?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are the most over over-consulted, over-engaged community cohort in Australia. There are constantly people like me, researchers, community engagement specialists, being engaged to go in and talk to communities about a wide range of topics, often really sensitive topics. So we have to consider sort of engagement saturation and work out whether it's appropriate to go into that particular community to start with, and whether they've just had enough and need a break for a while. I think the worst part, if people were constantly being engaged and then seeing the positive outcomes from their giving of their knowledge and their experiences and their voice, then I think we'd be having a different conversation. But when you're constantly being asked about your experiences and your stories and what you think solutions are, and then never actually seeing those solutions put in place, you get over that pretty quickly.
And how do you navigate that as a practitioner? Like, what do you hold as important when considering to go into particularly an Indigenous community to consult with them?
Yeah, we do a couple of things. We always start from a basis of respect. We'll try and find out, engage with community leadership to find out how much engagement's been going on, how community's feeling, whether it's appropriate or not. So get a form of permission, if you like, from that local community to say, yes, come in, we do want to talk to you about this. We will do a bit of a mapping system, and there's some communities that everybody goes to. Sometimes it's about geographic reach. Dubbo's the perfect one. It's closer to Sydney. There's lots of flights in and out every day. Everyone goes to Dubbo. So trying to avoid, those oversaturated, over-consulted communities where you can. And then finally, we will often, where we can, engage local community-based First Nations researchers and jump on we'll do one of two things. We'll engage someone who's experienced, or we'll engage a community member who might have had a bit of experience running yarning circles or discussion groups and would like to be upskilled more. So we'll provide training. We usually do that pro bono as our offer, not so much to the client, but to the community, so that we leave behind something in that community. And for us, using local community researchers, it's great. It gives us a sort of immediate trust platform. If it's a community we haven't worked with a lot before, it gives us really deep insight into that community and how best to approach the engagement, how to design it, what's going to be the most sensitive, the most culturally appropriate, and the safest way to go forward with this.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I'm curious, Chris, in your practice and the work that you do, there's a role for technology, and technology's been an amazing liberator of giving everyone a voice, but it also gets misused. And I'm curious to understand how and what role do you think technology has in stakeholder engagement?
I think the opportunity is significant in so much as that the technology can give voice to those that are often unheard in the room. Often the quietest in the room are the ones holding back, and in some consultations they've got something to say, but it's not a safe space. And as much as you try and create that, it's difficult. And I think technology allows you to overcome some of those inhibitors and give voice to those who are often voiceless. The other part of it, if used really well, the transparency of the technology gives sort of a collective view of bringing people together or not in terms of that, and showcases how that voice is being used and whether that technology is sort of showing how it's being integrated back into some of the the decision making, some of the processes that you're involved in. So I think it's opportune to start thinking about how do you cut out some of the filtering that often goes on in community engagement. I mean, people are often engaged who are dependent upon a consultancy in that engagement, and want to get the next consultancy and deliver up maybe what the client wants to hear as opposed to what the community wants to share. And technology's got that ability to cut out that expense and give community a more direct, immediate, transparent and proper voice into this process. And I think that's the great opportunity for it, to streamline it and to give a bit more, power to what the engagement's intended to do and provide some more immediate feedback. I mean, ultimately, community should be determining what questions should be asked. In fact, they are the ones that need to be designing the questions, because they're the ones who are designing what the feedback and providing the feedback. So I think technology plays a great space for that, because it takes some of the bias out of people that are involved in engagement. As much as they attempt to do it themselves, you can't. That's the bottom line. Maybe there's still a bit of bias in the technology, but
there's a lot of bias in the technology, Chris.
yeah, true.
Cecilia, what do you have to add there?
To start with?
Yes.
Yeah, look, I agree with Chris up to a point. I think, and I've used various technology platforms for highly sensitive topics, like male-to-male sex, health engagements, things like that, where the anonymity that the technology provides means that you can get a much deeper and richer involvement from the groups that you're talking to. And First Nations and called communities are the two biggest uptakers of technology, the fastest uptakers of technology in the country. And I've got this great story of meeting a gentleman who arrived in Australia as a refugee with his smartphone. He'd just come out of a refugee camp in Sudan somewhere like that, and he's saying to me, and he's in Sydney, he's going, what is the problem with the internet in this country? I had better internet connection in the refugee camp in the desert. Going, oh, I'm really sorry about that. And I think there's three big barriers for using technology, particularly with the communities that I work with. One is geographic bias, one is language bias, and one is probably what I call the safety bias. And so language bias, everything's done in English. That automatically cuts out people who have English as their first language but have low proficiency in it. People who have English as a second language, or in a First Nations setting in a lot of remote communities, third, fourth or fifth language. And people who are recently arrived migrants with low English proficiency, or who've been here, like my family, for 60 years and still have extremely limited levels of English proficiency. But there's also the safety barrier as well. And say in First Nations communities, often devices will be shared around. So if you are using a platform where the data is held on, say, the person's smartphone, and they're in a domestic and family violence situation and their partner gets hold of the phone, then you have just created a massive problem for that person. So I think technology is great if you can make it work for the community. And I guess one of the basic principles that Jamana always uses in any sort of engagement is meeting the community where they're at. You meet the community. You don't expect them to come to you in any way, shape or form. You meet them where they are in a way that is physically safe, culturally safe, and geographically appropriate as well. And if we can make all those round pegs and square pegs and round holes, whatever the saying is, fit, then I think technology is excellent.
That's a really
But a lot of communities still have a tradition of wanting to sit down and talk, though. You've got to take that into consideration. Yeah,
absolutely.
I just probably, I've never disagreed.
You're going to disagree with me, Chris?
I never would disagree with you, Cecilia. But I would say, in terms of what technology does, it allows you to be a bit more creative. And I think Cecilia's point about the English bias is true. But I think one of the wonderful things about technology, it can what it can do is build upon some amazing engagements that have occurred. And I'm thinking sort of from the climate change perspective in the Pacific around paper macheing islands and landscapes. And, you know, that basic sort of engagement and tool about shaping what's changed from a visual perspective. And that engagement brought people in. And the beauty about technology, and I probably should have articulated this more, is you can visualize what change might mean. And again, if I'm looking at landscapes or I'm looking at the way things might transform, again, sort of from a climate change mitigation or adaptation perspective, you can model what that change looks like. You can model what that story was. You can model what things can be. And it does resonate. And I think that's the part that I get excited by, because some of that consultation where you can actually transform the story, transform the words into a visual display, and people can see what it might look like. And I think we all sort of, we get a bit caught up with what we're hearing, and sometimes don't tell me, show me, which is sort of part of good governance, comes into play. And I know it's created by technology, some of the visuals, but it does give people sometimes the words just become meaningless. But if you can show what actually is the possible, and this is what you're going to, and you can be held account that, hang on, you know, this is not what's going on. That's your check in the process. That's where the exciting part to me of technology comes in, is that sort of visual manifestation of what I'm trying to consult for.
Absolutely.
So that was not a, you know.
No,
so
you were not disagreeing with me. No. And I will now agree with Chris. And I think it's actually more because primarily I'm now a researcher, and sort of engagement is what I do as part of data collection activities. I'm a qualitative researcher, but technology is incredibly useful, and there is so much connection between research, qualitative research, and engagement, and the ability to socialize your research through technology and then use it to engage with the community is fantastic. It's almost mind-blowing. And I went straight to the work that University of Newcastle has done, mapping the massacre sites across Australia. So you can now go through University of Newcastle's website to bring up an interactive map of Australia, and have a look at the story and find every single massacre site that ever happened. And when you look at the map, it's a little mind-blowing because the country is just covered with these dots. That's incredible. I think it's really useful in a truth-telling, story collection, and socialization sort of sense. It's really powerful in shifting people's views and mindsets and, I guess, worldviews.
Yeah, I think it's really great as well at flushing out assumptions, and particularly where, like, perhaps an infrastructure project or something like that, Chris, you were talking about being able to show them what the change is going to look like, and being able to understand from a community, from a stakeholder, like, how would you interact with this? And they'd be like, no, we're thinking like this, and you're like, wow, that completely blows the assumptions of what we were thinking about, and let's have a conversation about how it's going to work. And so I think there's some real benefits, but I think there's some challenges in there as well. Cecilia, you mentioned a moment ago one of the principles that you rely upon, which is starting where the stakeholder is. What are the other principles that you draw upon in your practice?
I think the foundation principle is respect. Respect for the community, respect for their culture and their values and their needs in the engagement space, valuing the voice, and sometimes that is hard, and you will take on a project and then get into it and realize that it is a ticker box exercise, and that's really frustrating. But trying to make sure that your client or whoever you're doing the work for is going to value the voice, because you're collecting a piece of someone and their knowledge, and that needs to be respected and valued. And I think allowing for time as a value or as a key principle, making sure that, and different communities see time in very different ways, and trying to make a client, and often it's government for us, it'll be made up of, you know, a large group of people of Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Celtic descent who have one view of time, which is very linear, trying to make them understand that actually most communities around the world, apart from yours, see time in a very different way, and you need to allow more than the 4 or 5 weeks or 6 weeks you've assigned to this community engagement piece if you're going to do it properly. But I think respect is, and centering the voice of the community, are probably the 2 foundation pieces. I know Chris has probably got other ones he can add.
It probably comes a little bit from a personal perspective, in so much as what's my role there. You know, my appearance gives something away that I'm an old white guy, and so what's my role if I'm invited in to a community engagement? Like, why am I there? And it's important. And why have I been invited in by an Indigenous organisation to do that sort of consultation with communities or different communities? And if I can reconcile what my role is, and often it's a contentious, you know, there's a contentious question to be asked, there's a contentious development or process, because, you know, I represent sort of a colonial past, and the impacts are felt today and well into the future, and the consequences of the past relate back to massacre stories. So I represent certain aspect, and sometimes the need to consult is not a really safe space for a First Nations person to be in that space. And so I'm probably more equipped to take on that sort of position. So there's a bit of self-reflection. What's my role? Am I being asked to displace something that could easily be done by somebody else? Am I there because of a safety issue, I'm actually more representative and will get a fairer and more honest answer because of what I represent? You know, and that's a real key part to it, is if I can understand what my role in it and why I was brought in, that's really important. The other part to that is the invitation, you know. So, and it goes beyond, there's a contract, and that's great, but it's the invitation of a community to have that component. And I know Cecilia talked about checking the power at the door. It's more about giving power to the community, saying, actually, you've got all the power here. You're telling the story. You're setting the conditions on what's recorded, what's not recorded, where that story goes. But more importantly, you're setting the conditions whether we actually come in and listen to that story today or tomorrow or sometime down the track. And I think that if you know your role and you know that there's an invitation there, and if the invitation's not forthcoming, it's nothing personal. I mean, 200 and something years of trying to kill, you know, a demographic in this country. Don't take it personally. It goes well beyond yourself. Then don't pursue it, because that's just pointless consultation. And wait, because the time's not right. And have that sort of strength in your own sort of convictions in a lot of ways. And no doubt, if the client's going to shop around and get somebody to still do it, it's probably not the gig for people like Cecilia and I anyway.
Mm. When you're engaging, how do you know that you've got the right stakeholders?
You never do. But if you've got people in the room who
You
then,
don't until they're talking to you.
yeah, and then if they share, oh, you should talk to old mate, you know, there's another person, then you sort of know you're in the room, and that they are connected. If you're feeling pretty isolated and there's just sort of one point to it, you always got the right people in the room. Just sometimes there's got to be more people in the room. And so every consultations in and itself is important and valid, because it is somebody contributing in. And I think if you don't take the insights from everyone, you lose something. But normally, if you're in the right zone and there's sort of layers and trust, and this comes back again to Cecilia's point about trust and respect. It's a reciprocity. If you walk in with that, and it's obvious that a lot of groups, communities that you're engaging with, it opens up, and the invitation widens, and you build up and you leverage that trust that's being offered to you, and often, you can walk into a community and they'll say, "Oh, yeah, my aunt, my uncle sort of said, yep, you're okay." And if you can hear that, you're stepping in. If you don't hear that, maybe you haven't done the right job last time you did some of this stuff.
Yeah. And I think two things as well. When you're actually in the middle of the yarn or the focus group or the discussion or whatever you want to call it, from the data that you're collecting, from what people are telling you, whether you're on the right track or not. But often it's what you get when you're not in the room that's really important, and it's someone in the room saying, "Oh, my aunt who lives down at number 20, you should go and talk to her." And you realise when you get there that she's got 6 of her grandchildren there today, so she was never going to make it to the yarning circle. So you go and have a cuppa with aunt and sit down, and talking to her is as rich or better than the group of 20 people that you just talked to. So I think in our space, we always need to leave time around. We don't, and flying in and flying out is possibly the worst thing you can do with a remote community as well. And that's about the time question. You've got to leave time to be sent in all these different directions by the initial group that you talk to, because they will then tell you who you need to go and talk to. So you need to leave the time for the cup of tea at the kitchen table or the park bench or the sitting in the dirt under a tree, talking to a group of uncles who can't be asked coming down the street to sit in the yarning circle because they've done 35 of them so far this year. And frankly, until they see you or somebody in their community says she's all right, have a chat with her, it's not going to happen.
And a really good rule of thumb, if you're doing more than 10% of the talking,
shut up.
Well, yeah, then it's hard going. If it's and that's it. If you haven't cracked that nut to open it up and let a whole lot of other people talk, then really you're just pushing it uphill.
Yeah, and sometimes it's as simple as you've designed the questions wrong as well. I will always go back after the first X amount, and if I know I'm not landing it, then it's back to the questions. What have we done wrong in designing these questions? We're asking the wrong thing of these people, and so rejigging what you're asking, and hoping it, and usually goes a lot smoother from there.
And how do you deal then with the information asymmetry that might naturally come with going in and engaging with stakeholders? Meaning, say it is a big infrastructure project or something, you've got a lot more knowledge about what's being proposed, and you've got to share that and get feedback on that. How do you work with that to ensure that you're spending that time listening and being open, but also giving them the information that they need to contribute appropriately?
I've got to admit, I don't do big infrastructure projects because usually there are pockets of real change happening in that space, but really up until now, that's where you get the serious ticker box exercises. But there is, in New South Wales at least, a shift to place-based design. There's a state government policy that the State Architects Office, led by Dylan Convegnari, who's a First Nations architect, have adopted. It's really influencing, and people at Lendlease have been doing it sort of concurrent to New South Wales government. So, and that's about bringing the First Nations community in the place where you are doing the development of the infrastructure project or whatever it is, and bringing them in from the start. And it's about understanding how to design on country, and doing it in a sensitive way that takes account of where you are and who the First Peoples are, what the culture is of the place, and weaving that in. So you're not just doing the stock standard colonial approach of, terra nullius. There's no one here before we built this big bridge / building / apartment block / university. But it's, that's slow steps, but it's really promising. And I found that the professionals get possibly as much, if not more, out of the engagement experience than the First Nations community members do. I've met some people at some of the big construction companies whose minds have been blown and who've said to me that literally their worldview has shifted through working on a place-based project with a place-based designing on country approach. So it can be really, really powerful for the other, the consultant, the client side of it as well. I don't know, did that answer the question?
Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, as multi-billion-dollar, infrastructure projects, have reams and reams of paper, it's still pretty simple. Like, I'm going to build a building, I'm going to build a bridge, I'm going to put a road in. I mean, the concepts aren't difficult, with whoever you're talking to, whether it's a farming community or if it's First Nations, remote community talking about a housing project, or whoever it ends up being. For the most part, and let's set aside quantum accelerators and some funky stuff, but for the 99% of probably what's going on in Australia at the moment, they're not difficult initiatives. What we want to try and do is we want to do this. Okay, and then it's if it's around place, what's the story that you want to share? And Cecilia's point about revisiting the questions, there was an engagement I was involved in, invited into, and we threw all the questions out and said, we just need what the story people want to share with us. That is ultimately what it is. What's the story that you want to share about this place? What's the story that you think people should take away from this place? And that's the key part. So all the questions, they get answered by inviting that in and setting that sort of opportunity to share a story. And in those stories are typically all the questions you weren't smart enough to ask anyway, because you're getting all the answers. So it's definitely just rethinking where it goes with this, and it's really important. And if you can't explain to a 5-year-old or a 95-year-old the project, then don't go in yet until you can, and it's because ultimately they're not difficult concepts, within reason. Within reason, most of them are pretty basic, and for the most part, if it's super high tech, then maybe the consultation processes, we need a whole lot of education before we even get to consultation, because then up until then there's none of that reciprocity or respect, because we're disrespecting people for no reason and no fault of their own. They're not up the curve with understanding quantum physics. So breaking it down, giving the basis, and then have the consultation, rather than barge in and say, we're going to do this thing that we can't really explain, and do you want it or not? There's none of what we've been talking about involved in those sorts of conversations. So break it down, keep it simple to yourself, and invite people to share a story. It doesn't matter where they're coming from, and that's that opportunity, I think, to make it pretty rich.
I'm curious.
Sorry, I can just jump in there, Victoria. And if you're the person who needs the engagement done, so if you're, from our perspective, you're the client or you're the project owner, before you even think about the community engagement side of this, ask yourself whether you're willing to change what you're planning based on what you're being told. And if you're not, then what is the point? And infrastructure projects, I always think of roads and highways, infrastructure projects in this context. And there's a great story of one of the Scandinavian countries that have fairy mythology, like the Irish do, and a highway being built, and the local Indigenous community pointing out that it was going to go straight through what we call a fairy glen or a fairy dale, which is a dip in the land where the fairies, supposedly live. And so this highway got rerouted around it. so it wasn't disturbed. And it might have taken people an extra 60, 30 seconds to go in this loop, but the fairy tale was saved, and the community was happy, and the culture was really old culture was retained. And I think of that in the context of, say, scar trees here. Don't knock down the scar. If you're doing an infrastructure project, listen to what the community is telling you. Listen to what the First Nations community are telling you about what cultural history you have there, and reroute around the scar trees. Yeah, don't knock them down. So don't do Yunkin, George. I think, let's not see that happen again.
And it goes back to, when you take this on, are you at the design and governance stage of the conversation, or are you at such a removed distance from any of this sort of, that you can't change anything? Then why are you taking it on? For people that have got to pay a mortgage and do all those sorts of good things, that's why they would take it on. But if you've got an opportunity to be able to be part of a process that can be a little bit more discerning, then you really want to do a bit of self-reflection, because when you step into that room, it's pretty obvious why you're there.
I'm curious, when stakeholder engagement, you gather data to help inform the decisions being made. I'm curious, when you have stakeholders that have competing points of view, and they might be from the same category, they both might be community with two different points of view, or they might be different stakeholders from different groups with different points of view. How do you navigate and support your clients or whomever you're working with to make the right decision when you've got competing interests, or equally when there's no right thing to do? So often it's the options are all bad. They're all bad options. You're going to cause impact in a bad way. How do you navigate to get to the right decision when that situation emerges?
You ask the client what recompense they're willing to make if there's no other way except a way that's going to be damaging. And if that's the case, then they're going to have to pay for it. I think when things are explained to people appropriately and they're given all the information they need to be able to see something clearly, most people understand difficult decisions. What people, I think, and this is not a cultural thing, what most people don't understand is a decision that's going to be harmful to them, that's going to happen anyway. And I'm thinking about the Northern Beaches Council that's had the furore in Sydney in the last 48 hours. For my sins, have got a bit of a background in local government. I don't know what I did in the previous life to deserve that, but chances are that council's rates probably did need a massive hike. And that is not about that particular council. That is about the way that local council rates are allowed to be organised in New South Wales. There's a rate pegging system that the state government controls. So, and a lot of councils don't like to raise rates little bit by little bit over the years. And so you'll end up in a situation where you have to do this massive rates hike. So I think that's a situation where the decision's already been made and they did the consultation. So I would say kind of what was the point of doing that? Things were going to be riled up anyway. You were going to end up on the front page of the paper anyway, regardless of how many people shouted at you before the council meeting. But I think that, I mean, what I've seen so many times is, again, it's about people not being, and for me, it's a colonial mindset. I know what is best. I know I have to go and talk to this community because it's on the list of things that's now expected of me. I'm not going to change my mind. This community is telling me this is going to be incredibly damaging in all these various ways, but I'm still proceeding with it. And I think that's probably the worst possible outcome for everyone, including, and often for me it's government, including government, because they just continually lose the trust of community. And I think Chris said earlier, most people know, most communities have the solutions for the problems and know what's best for them. And if you continue with a disconnect between what government thinks is best and what is actually best for the community, then you're just constantly chipping away at any sort of trust in government, which ultimately, as we have seen in various nations we're allied to, can be really dangerous in the long term. Yeah.
Chris, anything to add?
Listen, I'll pick up on the point. The mantra of do no harm is got to be paramount in this. So the consequences of whatever, and I think communities, irrespective of where they come from, they have the capacity and have always had the capacity to resolve these conflicts of ideas. Often what's happened, we've stripped that capacity from many communities, or they don't feel they've got the power or the capabilities to do that. But this notion of if whatever the result is, that you can frame it as the organisation that's actually doing the consultation step out of the process with the one caveat saying, we're going to actually respect the community to resolve this matter themselves. Our mantra in this will be, we hope you can look towards a solution that causes no harm. And that's, you know, that's front of mind in a lot of things that go on in Sydney because of such a fractured nature of different communities. And if you can have that no harm mantra as best as possible, and allow time and space for communities to resolve some of these issues, and that doesn't mean they'll agree with each other, but at least come to a mechanism and empower that to happen. I mean, I know that's probably novel in 90% of the cases, but I think if you can come to that and at least make the recommendations, that's where you walk away from. That is ultimately the best that you can do.
We'll get to the path of least harm, and you know, sort of best practice in that difficult space is try to come to agreement on the path of least harm, and look at how you can compensate for the harm that is going to be the result. And it's really interesting to see sort of the history of negotiations between First Nations communities and mining companies in the native title space, where native title's been granted the mining company on Crown land, and the mining company then pays huge sums of money to continue that. And there's this, often the negotiations centre around, well, you are doing this thing that is killing country in this space. Here are our immediate needs around education, health, employment, whatever it is. You can compensate for what you're doing there so that we can build our nation and our people's capabilities and skills and life outcomes over here. So I think taking that mindset as well, it's just not always take. You've got to give back somehow.
Yep, and increasingly asking for equity in the mines or what have you as well. I'm curious, both. We've got just a couple of minutes left. What keeps you motivated in this space? We started off with it's a trend towards transactional. What keeps you motivated to work in this space, Chris?
The invitation. I mean, if you don't see this sort of as an old white guy, as precarious employment, then I think you're a little deluded. And every time there's an invitation to come in, it's the thing that motivates me. And at a point in time, that invitation will stop. Great, that it's gone somewhere else. But as soon as but while it lasts, that's what motivates me to contribute, because there's a part of whatever the process is that values the role that I might be able to play in that process, and and they value the way that I might be able to bring it in. So I'm always keen to get the invite, but I won't be ever disappointed when it stops.
Cecilia?
Yeah, so I think it's the sheer privilege. It's sort of in two parts. It's the sheer privilege of being able to sort of be near the incredible generosity of the communities that I'm invited into, and that never gets old. But I think on the structural side, the national agreement on closing the gap, which is the first time there's been a closing the gap agreement between First Nations communities, representative organisations on their behalf, and governments, is it's going to take a long time for these things to unfold probably, but that's a real game changer. And I think out of that, the concepts around self-determination, not concepts, the embodiment of self-determination for Aboriginal communities, community control and nation building, where you can lay your hands on the really positive outcomes as slow as they are, because of a number of factors that I think is a real driver as well.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for your time here today. I think there's some really key things that I took away from the conversation. Start early, do no or low harm, listen, spend your time listening, and really hold that respect for leave your privilege at the door and hold that respect for the communities that you're going into. So thank you both for joining us today. Thank you also to Wizer for sponsoring this episode of Higher Business. Look for upcoming episodes of Higher Business on your LinkedIn, and thank you all for joining us in listening today.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thank you.